On October 17, 1973, a group of oil-producing nations in the Middle East made a single political decision, 7,000 miles away from Detroit, that would do more to kill the American muscle car than any government regulator, any insurance actuary, or any corporate committee ever had. Gas prices didn't just rise that winter. In some parts of the country, they roughly tripled within months, and Americans who had never once thought about their car's fuel economy suddenly found themselves waiting in lines that stretched for blocks just for a chance to fill a tank that a big block V8 could empty in a single afternoon of hard driving. This isn't the countdown of the fastest cars from a single year. This is the story of exactly how and exactly when the golden age of the American muscle car actually came to an end, and why the real killer wasn't any one single thing, but three separate forces that all closed in on Detroit at almost exactly the same moment. This is a story of the year a Pontiac GTO with the exact same 400 cubic inch engine that made 366 horsepower in 1970 was making barely 200 horsepower by 1974. Not because the engineers had gotten worse at their jobs, but because everything around that engine had changed. Insurance companies, environmental regulators, and the foreign oil embargo all arrived at Detroit's doorstep within the same 18-month window, and none of them were interested in waiting for the muscle car era to end gracefully on its own terms. To understand how the muscle car era actually died, you have to understand that it didn't happen all at once, and it didn't happen for just one reason. Three separate forces had been building against Detroit's performance cars since the very start of the decade, each one moving at its own pace until they all converged on the same 18-month window between late 1972 and early 1974. The first force had been building the longest: emissions regulation. The Clean Air Act, signed by President Nixon back in 1970, had already forced compression ratios down across the entire industry, and it was about to demand something far more drastic: catalytic converters, mandatory on virtually every new car sold in America starting with the 1975 model year, requiring unleaded fuel and fundamentally reshaping how every engine in Detroit could be tuned. The second force was newer, and it was aimed with surgical precision directly at the exact cars this whole series has spent 15 episodes celebrating: insurance surcharges. And the third force arrived almost overnight, with no warning at all, in the fall of 1973. Let's walk through exactly how it happened. Long before gas prices became the story, insurance companies had already quietly declared war on the muscle car. By the early 1970s, actuaries had spent years collecting claims data, and the pattern was undeniable. Young drivers, high horsepower engines, and accident rates were all tightly connected. States like New York began allowing insurers to apply so-called supercharger surcharges on high-performance models, and companies across the country followed suit, sometimes adding hundreds of extra dollars a year to a policy simply because a car carried the wrong badge or the wrong engine code. A 1970 Chevrolet Chevelle SS might cost roughly $300 a year to insure for a young driver, compared to barely $100 for an economical Toyota Corolla covering the exact same driver, the exact same roads, and the exact same coverage. For a generation of buyers who had built the entire muscle car boom in the first place, young, often first-time car owners, exactly the demographic Pontiac had targeted with the original GTO back in 1964, that kind of premium made an already expensive car payment genuinely unaffordable. The horsepower war hadn't stopped because Detroit's engineers ran out of ideas. It slowed down because an entire generation of the buyers who wanted these cars most could no longer afford to legally drive one home from the dealership. While insurance companies squeezed muscle cars from one direction, Washington squeezed them from another. The 1970 Clean Air Act had already forced manufacturers to lower compression ratios across nearly every engine in America, so cars could run on lower octane, eventually unleaded, gasoline. That alone had knocked meaningful horsepower off engines that had barely changed mechanically from 1970 to 1971. But the bigger blow was still coming. Starting with the 1975 model year, the Environmental Protection Agency would require catalytic converters on nearly every new car sold in the United States, devices that demanded unleaded fuel and imposed exhaust flow restrictions that were fundamentally incompatible with the free-breathing, high-compression engines that had defined the entire muscle car era. Detroit's engineers didn't have years to prepare for this transition. They had a matter of months, and the compromises it forced, smaller carburetors, milder camshafts, exhaust systems choked down to meet the new emissions targets, hit right as two other crises were closing in at the exact same time. On October 6, 1973, Egypt and Syria launched a surprise attack against Israel, beginning what became known as the Yom Kippur War. When the United States moved to resupply Israel's military just days later, the Organization of Arab Petroleum Exporting Countries responded by halting oil exports to the United States entirely, beginning on October 17, 1973. The effect on American gas prices was immediate and brutal. In the span of just a few months, prices at the pump roughly tripled to quadrupled in many parts of the country, and for the first time since the Second World War, ordinary Americans found themselves facing genuine fuel shortages. Gas station lines stretching for blocks, odd-even rationing systems in some states based on license plate numbers, and the level of public anxiety about fuel that the country hadn't experienced in a generation. For a muscle car that returned somewhere between 7 and 13 miles per gallon in ordinary driving, filling a 20-gallon tank at the new, dramatically higher prices could easily run the equivalent of well over $100 in today's money, an amount that made owning, let alone regularly driving, a big block performance car feel almost irresponsible to a huge portion of the buying public overnight. The embargo officially ended in March of 1974, but the damage to American driving habits was already permanent. Buyers who had spent the 1960s and early 1970s chasing horsepower numbers suddenly found themselves asking a completely different question at the dealership. How many miles per gallon does his car actually get? Fuel-efficient imports from Japan, brands like Toyota, Honda, and Datsun, which had been steadily gaining a foothold in the American market throughout the early 1970s, suddenly found themselves perfectly positioned for a moment nobody in Detroit had fully anticipated. By 1975, some of these smaller, considerably more efficient imports were outselling America's traditional muscle car offerings by a wide and rapidly growing margin. It's genuinely difficult to overstate how quickly American car culture pivoted in this exact window. A car that had been an object of genuine desire and status just 3 or 4 years earlier could suddenly feel, to plenty of ordinary buyers, like an expensive, thirsty, hard-to-insure liability. Nothing tells the story more clearly than a single engine that didn't actually change very much at all: Pontiac's 400 cubic inch V8 as it appeared under the hood of the GTO. In 1970, at the absolute peak of the muscle car era, that engine was rated at 366 horsepower. By 1974, largely the same basic engine, now wearing lower compression, a smaller carburetor, and considerably more restrictive exhaust plumbing to meet tightening emission standards, was making barely 200 horsepower. That's not a typo, and it's not a case of two completely different engines being confused with each other. It's the exact same block, doing the exact same job in a completely different regulatory and economic world just 4 years apart. It's the single clearest illustration of everything this episode has been building toward. The muscle car era didn't die because Detroit's engineers forgot how to build a fast engine. It died because the rules governing what an engine was allowed to do and the economics of who could actually afford to own and insure one both changed faster than any engineering department could realistically keep pace with. By 1973 and 1974, the casualties were piling up fast, and they included some of the most legendary names this entire series has spent months celebrating. The 426 Hemi, arguably the single most feared engine in American muscle car history, had already quietly disappeared after the 1971 model year, unable to meet the emissions and fuel requirements coming down the pipeline. Chrysler's 446 Barrel followed it into retirement after 1971 as well. Ford celebrated Boss 302, Boss 351, and Boss 429 were all gone by the end of 1971. Chevrolet's fearsome LS6 454 disappeared from the Chevelle after 1970 and left the Corvette lineup entirely after 1971. One by one, the engines that had defined the entire golden age simply stopped appearing on order sheets, not with any dramatic farewell announcement, but quietly, model year by model year, as each one became too expensive, too difficult to certify, or too hard to insure to remain commercially viable. No single story captures the muscle car era's decline more completely than what happened to the car that started the entire movement in the first place. By 1973, the GTO that had once outsold every other muscle car in America was struggling badly, weighed down by punitive insurance surcharges and a horsepower rating that kept shrinking year over year, even as a brand new, more efficient Pontiac model called the Grand Am began stealing away buyers who wanted a genuinely modern performance sedan. For 1974, Pontiac made a decision that would have been unthinkable just 5 years earlier. Rather than continuing the GTO as its own model, the company folded it into a simple option package on the compact Ventura, a car built to compete with economy imports rather than genuine muscle car rivals. Sales still weren't enough to justify continuing even that reduced version, and Pontiac quietly discontinued the GTO name entirely after the 1974 model year. The car that had exploited a corporate loophole to become the single most important muscle car in American history had been reduced in exactly 1 decade to an option box on a compact economy car nobody particularly associated with performance at all. Not everything died. A small handful of nameplates found a way to keep the flame alive even in this genuinely hostile new environment. Pontiac's Firebird Trans Am remarkably kept fighting harder than almost anything else in Detroit, continuing to offer its big 455 cubic inch engine right through the mid-1970s, even as most of its rivals scaled back dramatically or disappeared entirely. And the Trans Am would go on to post its best ever sales year in 1979, proof that genuine demand for a fast-looking, well-marketed performance car hadn't actually disappeared, even if the raw horsepower underneath had. Chevrolet kept the Corvette alive as America's flagship sports car throughout the entire decade, adapting its engines generation after generation to meet each new round of regulations rather than simply giving up. And the Ford Mustang, even after its controversial, considerably smaller Mustang II redesign for 1974, eventually found its way back to genuine V8 power within just a couple of model years, proving the appetite for an affordable performance car hadn't vanished either. Look at the production totals from this exact window, and the decline becomes impossible to argue with. Cars that had sold in the tens of thousands just a few years earlier were suddenly selling in the low thousands, or in some cases discontinued entirely within a single model year's notice. Manufacturers that had once competed fiercely over who could offer the single largest, most powerful engine were now competing over something almost nobody had cared about just 5 years earlier: fuel economy ratings. The entire competitive framework that had defined Detroit's horsepower war for a full decade simply stopped making commercial sense almost overnight, and every single manufacturer covered across this entire series had no real choice but to follow the same basic path away from raw displacement and toward compliance, efficiency, and considerably more modest performance claims. If there's one myth this episode is meant to correct, it's the idea that a single event killed the muscle car era all at once. The oil embargo gets most of the popular credit, largely because it was so sudden, so visible, and so easy to point to as a single historical date. But the insurance industry had already been squeezing these cars for several years before a single gas line ever formed, and the emissions regulations that fundamentally reshaped what an engine was even allowed to do had been written into law since 1970, years before OPEC's embargo ever began. The oil crisis wasn't the cause of the muscle car era's death. It was the final blow, arriving at the exact moment two other, slower-moving forces had already weakened the entire category to the point where it could no longer withstand a genuine external shock. For the people who had grown up watching this exact category of car define an entire decade of American culture, watching it collapse in real time over the course of barely 2 or 3 model years was genuinely disorienting. The same magazines that had spent the late 1960s breathlessly covering quarter-mile times and horsepower wars were now writing headlines about fuel economy and emissions compliance. Dealership lots that had once proudly displayed the fastest, loudest cars a manufacturer could build were increasingly filled with smaller, quieter, considerably more modest models, built to survive an entirely different set of economic and regulatory pressures. For anyone who bought their first car or fell in love with a particular engine during the peak years this entire series has spent celebrating, watching that world disappear so quickly left a mark that, for plenty of people, has never really faded. So what does this entire story actually prove? That the muscle car era wasn't killed by a single villain, a single bad decision, or a single piece of legislation. It was worn down from 3 separate directions at once: insurance companies who had finally connected horsepower to risk, environmental regulators who had finally decided air quality mattered more than quarter-mile times, and the foreign oil embargo that arrived with almost no warning at all, right at the exact moment the other 2 pressures had already left the entire category vulnerable. It's also a story about how quickly an entire culture can change. Just a few years after cars like the ones this whole series has celebrated were selling in record numbers, an entire generation of Americans were lining up for gasoline instead, worrying about horsepower ratings that had been cut in half, and watching some of the most legendary names in automotive history quietly disappear from dealership lots 1 model year at a time. The muscle car era didn't end because Detroit stopped caring about speed. It ended because for a few genuinely difficult years, the entire country simply couldn't afford to keep caring about it in quite the same way. Were you old enough to remember watching the muscle car era disappear in real time? The gas lines, the shrinking horsepower numbers, the nameplates that quietly vanished from the showroom floor? Did your father, your uncle, or a neighbor on your street ever tell you the story of trading in a big block performance car simply because they could no longer afford to insure or fuel it? Write your memory in the comments below.